Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Davis. I'm the Director of Research here at the Deason Center, headquartered at SMU in Dallas. I'm going to just say a couple of introductory words. If you're joining us and I'm already speaking, please do not worry. I'm not saying anything of importance except to welcome everybody. Um, we're really excited to have Dr. Amy Mahler here today. She's a PhD economist from the RAND Corporation and also her colleague Shihan, who've been working on this important piece about public defender caseloads. We were really excited a few months ago now to have Aviv Caspi come and talk about his work. And with Dr. Mahler and Shihan, we have now really covered the waterfront because there is this new wave in empirical work on showing the impact of caseloads on case outcomes in indigent defense. So we're really excited to be able to talk this through properly. We do have, as some of you will already know, this is part of our sequence on what we call the CJR workshop series, CJR being short for criminal justice reform or criminal justice research. It's characterized as a workshop because we do try and bring in people who are doing the freshest work right on the bleeding edge in order that they can, in fact, workshop it with us, just show us what they're finding and get people's reactions. We're really pleased by the sign up today, and we really look forward to hearing Dr. Mahler. So we will just give it a couple more minutes. I see people still coming in to join. Again, my name's Andrew Davis. I'm the Director of Research here at the Deason Center. And you are here to see Dr. Mahler and Shihan talking about their work on public defender caseloads. We will get started in just a minute or so. Okay, so much like when you microwave popcorn, what happens with the people arriving to the meeting is they all come at once, and then at some point there's a 2 second delay, and then you can turn the microwave off. So I think I think we can do that. Again, my name's Andrew Davis. Welcome to this CGR talk here at the Deason Center. We're delighted to be here with Dr. Amy Mahler and her colleague Xian, and really excited to hear your work, Amy and Xian, on public defender caseloads. I think we are ready to pass it over to you. Once you are done, we will invite people to speak up with their questions and answers. We're scheduled to go slightly more than an hour today, so we should have ample time to get through all of your points of curiosity. I will moderate that. I'll have a few questions of my own, I'm sure, but we would all much rather hear from the audience than hear from me, myself especially. Uh, my own thoughts are already in my head and none of them are interesting. So I would love to, we do want people to put up their hands. What I will ask you to do is put up your hands. You can put your questions in chat if you wish. I will then call on you and you can unmute, or I can speak your question if you would prefer. We're just a slightly larger group, so I don't want to ask people to unmute spontaneously. We'll have a kind of a system. And also at that time, my colleague Malia Brink, who's done a lot of work on indigent defense workloads, we're hoping she can join us, and we'll hope that we can get her response to Dr. Mahler and Xian's work as well at that time. But without further ado, then I'll pass it over to our speakers today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andy. This was a great introduction. So as Andy introduced, my name is Amy Mahler. I'm an associate economist at the RAND Corporation. As you see in the caveat at the bottom of the slide, this work was originally part of my doctoral dissertation in economics at University of Southern California. So this does not necessarily represent the views of the RAND Corporation. This was a separate work. And then this work is in collaboration with Shihan Liu, who's also on the call. She's a PhD student in economics at the University of Southern California. So thanks so much for coming. So the title of the talk is The Impact of Working Conditions on Productivity, Evidence from the U.S. Public Defense System. It's exciting that many of you may have also attended the seminar from Aviv Caspi, who is someone we've talked with extensively since our papers are very parallel. So I think this will be like a similar view on a similar issue with like strikingly similar findings, but I think useful for science. So let's get into it. So the big picture motivation that I usually start this talk with that I feel like is a little too pie in the or too obvious for such a well-versed audience such as this one is the outcome of a criminal case has very serious consequences for the defendant. So I'm citing all the econ literature. There is a ton of other literature here that shows links, but particularly causal links between conviction and incarceration time and labor market outcomes, health outcomes, welfare, et cetera. There's way more papers here that I could have cited. Just trying to get like the minimal set. I think in particular relevant to this talk is I want to situate like, okay, there's lots of different things that are affecting this relationship between being convicted and what happens downstream. What we want to see is what also determines being convicted. So looking upstream at what determines the outcome of the criminal case. And so I kind of zoom in on like there are there's lots of evidence that we have that there's inconsistent decision making by criminal justice actors. And so a lot of this literature has focused on judges in particular. So I think there's a paper where like if the judges team lost the football game, the defendants receive worse case outcomes, things like that. There's also evidence for prosecutors that their judgment can change. I think the perspective I wanted to take here was to go to a different part of the criminal justice system and essentially the last line of defense against a conviction, which is the US public defense system for many defendants, not for all, and look instead at workloads. So something that is really like policy relevant that we could change rather than something like the weather. So I think that's where this paper kind of situates itself relative to lots of other papers that have also looked at what determines something like a conviction or the length of a sentence. And so, again, I think for this audience, this will be very familiar tune. So we're studying how the workloads of public defenders affect the case outcomes of their clients. The Sixth Amendment gives us the right to counsel, but does not specify the workloads of the public defenders for sure. There's definitely been a lot of push and pull in the policy space around what exactly the amendment entails on the ground. And that's, I think, the motivation of a lot of the workload studies that both my colleagues and including myself at RAND have been working on, as well as many other groups have done these types of workload studies. And then for those who don't know, like public defenders are a huge part of the criminal justice system. They're representing low-income defendants, but they're by a recent or somewhat recent survey, I think it was like a decade ago, they're representing about 80% of felony cases. And anecdotally, workloads are a huge issue, even though this question up until recently had not really been studied. You can see from the news articles below that this is just a miscellaneous sampling, including I'm in the Los Angeles area, so our very own local, I think the oldest public defense office in the country is experiencing the same issues. And then I also wanted to like back out and say that like workload pressure has been studied. Like this is not a new type of question that has never been asked before. So we see particularly in healthcare settings that very high inflows of patients. I think we all heard this anecdotally during COVID. If everybody's kind of flowing into the emergency room, those outcomes are going to get worse across the board. So we know this holds in other service areas, but up until recently, this like causal question had not been studied. So let me get into what is this paper doing in all of this discussion. And so essentially we are estimating the causal effect of the public defender's workload on both the outcomes of the case, and I'll get into what the outcomes are that we use. And then the other unique contribution of this paper is that we also have very detailed information on attorney time use for one of the two settings that we study. So we have two states, and one of them we have a large detailed sample of attorney time use as well as the characteristics of the attorney. And so we look at like the main effects, like does workload have anything to do, or does it shift these outcomes meaningfully when we're controlling for everything else and kind of using our natural experiment setting. And then we look at whether there are heterogeneous effects by the case characteristics, the defendant characteristics, and the attorney characteristics. This is related to previous work. So I think the majority of papers, at least within economics, that look at causal relationships within the public defense sphere are papers that compare modes of provision of public defense. So my colleague James Anderson is on a paper here that basically compares full-time public defenders to assigned counsel. I think his paper was in Philadelphia. And basically, like if there's a quasi-random assignment to one type of attorney or another, how do those outcomes compare? And so this is related to this work in that we're looking at only the full-time public defenders, not the assigned counsel. And we're kind of taking a different perspective on, well, what else is affecting their outcomes, even if they're better than their alternatives, which I think is what most of these papers are. I think all of these papers find that the public defenders are better. They could do better if their working conditions were a little better. As I said before, this is also related to capacity constraints in public sector more broadly. And then I wanted to mention really specifically that Aviv Caspi's paper, I think it's called Overworking Public Defenders, if I remember the current working title, is also looking at the causal impact of public defender workloads on both case outcomes and time use. So we're looking in different settings and we're finding very similar like headline results about the impact on incarceration length in particular. I think that would be like the most significant, consistent thing that we've both found. And so he's studying county-based settings. I have state-based settings, but I think for the body of evidence around the relationship between workloads and case outcomes, it's nice that there are two papers. As I said before, like this is great for social science. So getting into what are we doing here? So we have two states. One is Kentucky, and the other one is an anonymous state by our data use agreement. And so I think I can say that it is not a strange, like a really bizarre state. It's not Hawaii or something, but the state is still anonymous. Both of these states have state-run public defense systems and full-time public defenders within those systems. From my conversations with administrators in the two states of the public defense systems, as well as I went through lots of discussions with the individual offices. Their use of assigned counsel is pretty limited. I think it's primarily in these conflict cases where they have two defendants that they can't both represent. They would basically take the other case to the private sector, but otherwise they're not bringing them in consistently for workload. So I think that's helpful for thinking that like we're really observing the true workload of the public defenders. And so we have two two types of data that we're drawing on. One of them is at the case level. So each row in the database is a case. This comes from both states, both Kentucky, it's covering 2017 to 2018, and the anonymous state 2014 to 2016. So everything we're looking at here is pre-COVID and we should know that that's not affected, but something like this study could be done in a post-COVID era, and I think that would be really useful to advance the science as well. In the case level data set, we have fields related to, so the outcomes that we're going to look at are whether the client is convicted, whether they plead out, essentially, whether they plead guilty. Those two outcomes are pretty related. As there are not many trials. We don't have trial as a separate outcome because it's so rare. The length of the case is another outcome. We also have all the case characteristics, so what type of crime this was, whether it was a B, C felony, which is we've kind of homogenized across the two states. And then the characteristics of the defendant as well. So these are all the additional pieces of information we have that we put into our models. And then for Kentucky, we have the sentencing information. So just like keep in mind that anything we're saying related to incarceration is applicable to Kentucky. We also have this second data set, that's the second row in this little table, which is for the anonymous state. So we're covering the same cases that we have the main case information for. We also have this time use information. And so each row in this data set is like they spent, a third of an hour on communicating with the client on such and such date for such and such case. That's kind of our second data source that I think gets us at a very rich story of when the workloads rise and the car gets a little wobbly, what exactly is breaking down there? Is it something that we can potentially change? I think it helps with the policy implications. And then for this state as well, we also have the demographics of the public defender and their experience levels. So we can look at least correlational evidence, and I'll get into why it's correlational evidence of whether these effects vary by which public defender you have or what the demographics of the public defender and the experience in particular. So I'll pause there just in case there's any questions on the data before we get into anything else. Cool. Okay. I put too much text on this slide. So let's look at the workload measure. So,
I have a quick.
oh yeah.
How you doing?
Hey.
Well, I'm here in Dallas, Texas. I served 20 years in prison. I do criminal justice reform work for Fort Oak Cliff. And one thing I remember going through school when I was locked up, I seen that. Do you think that because Texas right now they ranks and I think they're the lowest state when it comes to money allocated to public defenders, that plays a part in conviction rates too? Because they don't have the money to investigate or they don't have the money to actually, do the work. And I just seen uh, a person that we do participatory defense with, when the prosecutor tried to get the defense attorney removed off a client's case because she was spending too much money, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, so do you think money plays a big part?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's running in the background of the discussion about workloads because, like, why are the workloads? One of the policy implications that can come out of this is, well, if we hire more public defenders in a given jurisdiction, the workloads will fall, and these, at least for the through the workload mechanism. But what you were talking about was really interesting too, because I think, for example, we don't have like some particular line that's like consultation with
Mm-hmm.
expert witness. I used to work in litigation consulting and like expert witnesses were like everything we were doing. And they was a huge contribution to those. That was civil cases, not criminal, but that could
Mm-hmm.
be like a potential. So we don't have that in our data set, but I could imagine other papers if there's the right circumstances to look at it kind of in this quasi-experimental way. Like what is the link between specific resources used by the public defense office and case
Mm-hmm.
outcomes? It's like this is just one lens, like the workload lens is like how many
Okay.
people do you have? How many cases do you have? But like also what else do you put into those cases? So we can see what happens when the workload rises for the particular task categories that we're able to observe. But I imagine there's other things that can go into a case that would improve the outcome, as I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. Great question.
I just want to say, I appreciate the question, Eric. What I want to suggest is that, and Amy, I appreciate also that you paused for questions on clarification. What I would like to suggest is that when people are asking questions during your presentation, we ask questions about clarification. And then if we want to also get into a deeper conversation about what it is that you found, let's save those questions for the end. But Amy, I'll let you call on questions as and when you please. But I just want to make sure that we have time for you to finish.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And I kind of condensed. I have 10 slides. There's like a longer amount of slides, but we will get to the end for sure. But Andy, will you tell me that I know there's sometimes questions in the chat, but my screen's a little funny. Will you tell me if I should answer the questions in the chat or no?
For sure. Yes, I will.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely. And people should feel free to write questions in the chat anytime. Thank you, Amy.
Perfect. All right. Okay, so let's go to the screen with lots of text I mentioned before. So for the workload measure, we talked a lot with the different offices within the two states we were working with. And essentially, there are a lot of different ways to measure how busy is the public defender with other cases during a given case. And so the similar paper to ours, Aviv Caspi's paper, looks at this a different way where he's counting how many cases overlap with the given case at any given time. I think we tried that method as well, and the results are similar. We went with our method because our cases are very long, and so sometimes that window of overlapping can be incredibly long. And so instead, we're counting how many open cases are there on every single day. So if a case lasts 3 days and they have, 3 cases the first day, 2 cases the second day, and 1 case the third day that are open, like they were closing cases real fast for some reason in this tiny, tiny case example, they would have 2 cases on average overall. So this is like our average daily caseload. And so here, like we do, the case length matters, but it's not as relevant. And I think the other thing I want to make sure that we say is that if we count cases over the entire window of a given case for some of our very, very long, severe cases that we have in this sample, we might be counting like a tail, like the end portion of the case. And I think this comes up a lot with like how long is a case? This comes up in my work currently on a workload study where like when do cases end is kind of a difficult question sometimes because there's all kinds of like does post-conviction count? And so in this setting it doesn't count, but you could conceivably say the public defender is still working, the case is not over. And so what we did to try to simplify this problem, and we've tried this a couple different ways, is to count the cases over the first 3 months if it's a low-level felony and 6 months if it's a high-level felony, and just kind of cap the average there. We've tried a lot of these different sizes of windows, but from the time use data, this seems to be the period in which public defenders are very actively working on the cases, like that initial period. And so, yeah, if there's other like windows that people would try, we're very open to suggestions, but this is how we've done it, at least for this paper, and tried a bunch of different versions as economists do. So this is our workload measure, is this average daily caseload measure, where it's like, how many cases do you have every single day during that initial period of the case? But to get into like the causal portion of this, because I think that's like very important for the contribution of this paper, if we want to say that like there's a cause and effect here, it's not just like they both move together, right? We can only do this if the workload is assigned, quote, randomly. And so economists obsess about randomization quite a bit. They have lots of different interesting methods to, as many of you are familiar with, to come up with kind of quasi-random experiments. So the problem that we're trying to solve here is that, well, there's two big problems, and there's probably other problems too that I couldn't fit on this slide. The first is cases may not be assigned to the public defender in a random way, like the office might handpick which attorney gets a given case, such that the workloads are going to vary based on the cases that are coming in, and that's a problem for us saying that this is causal. The second issue is like we're counting like the stock of cases that they have open, and they might not be able to close cases if they have a really intense case going on. Like they might just kind of ask for continuances or drag things out in some way, like, or they just might, like for the computer portion of this, they might not be able to log it on time if they're the ones, and in our data, the attorneys are logging everything. So this is a big problem, which would make the workload not random, because then it would be bigger when they have really intense cases, and it would look like a relationship that's not really there. So with all of that said, how do we proceed? So our strategy is twofold. The first part of it is that we restrict to a sample of 16 offices. There are 12 of them are in Kentucky and 4 of them are in the anonymous state. And we know from individually interviewing each of these offices, we understand how they assign the felony cases. So we ended up not using the misdemeanor cases in our main analysis because the way that they were assigned was much more heterogeneous. It seemed to involve the newer attorneys, at least within these specific offices. But for the felony cases, both not capital cases, but for like A through D felonies in Kentucky and A through E felonies in the other state, the anonymous state, the public defenders are basically assigned to a particular courtroom. So there's 2 versions of the rules. The vast majority, they're assigned to a courtroom, and they take all of the indigent cases that come into that courtroom. And so if you can imagine like a pipeline where the case is assigned to the courtroom in a random fashion, as has been shown, or basically is the substance of a lot of the judge related papers, where we have this kind of quasi-random experiment going on with judges. The cases come to the courtroom randomly, and then that public defender takes everything that comes into that courtroom as long as it's falling within the indigent category, which they're not determining themselves. The second type of rule listed here is that the public defender is assigned to a particular week of the month. So they have like an intake week, and they take everything that comes in that week, and then the rest of the weeks they're not taking in new cases. And so, at least for the first issue that we had mentioned on the previous slide, where like depending on how cases are assigned, we might not have like a causal thing to say here. That was in the that these offices with very strict rules help us address those concerns. The second part, the reverse causality, we're going to use an instrument. And so instrumental variables is like a whole universe within economics and many other fields that helps us deal with these types of issues. And so our instrument is the count of cases assigned previously to the index case. We have 2 months in the main specification to kind of balance the loss of data that comes with making this type of window and the instrument being related to our treatment, to our workload measure. But essentially, this is what we're doing is it's like an additional measure of workload on top of the workload that we already have. I think I want to skip down to the very bottom part here, which is the intuition of what we're estimating. And so essentially what we're doing is we take 2 cases, not really, but we take all the cases in the sample. But if you think of just 2 cases, they're both assigned to the same attorney, and one case has more, that attorney had more other cases at the same time as case A and had fewer cases at the same time as case B. So we are comparing within a given attorney. We're not comparing like across attorneys because their workload, the way that they're assigned to the courtroom, that may not be random. And that's something we would be worried about. Like if a really skilled attorney is assigned to a very difficult courtroom, I don't want to compare them to an inexperienced attorney assigned to a courtroom where there's like relatively lower severity cases coming in, because that is not a dimension that it's random. So that's kind of like the experiment that we're thinking of when we come up with these estimates is like, suppose there were 2 cases, they each had the same attorney, but that attorney had slightly different workloads at the time that they got that or during that case. Let me pause again just in case there's anything pressing, and maybe I'll drink a little bit of water. Right. Okay, so let's go to the results. So for case outcomes, these are our headline findings. I think the biggest one, and again, it mirrors, I think, both the magnitude of the increase of the workload, and the main effect that we find is the defendants of attorneys who have an additional standard deviation of workload. And I'm kind of trying to translate that as like, instead of having a very typically busy day, you're having very busy days during that case. Those defendants receive almost 7% longer prison sentences. So this comes out for like the average case in our sample, this comes out to about an additional month in prison. So this is like a really big effect. And I think the standard deviation is like just a way to translate. If you just think of one incremental case, it doesn't make that much of a difference. So we're trying to translate it into something that is more policy relevant. The second finding is that the case duration increases by 3.4%. So I think I had translated this. This was like, I think it's an additional week of length in the case based on the average case. We also see some increased probability of conviction and incarceration. These effects are less precisely estimated, so I wouldn't headline them. I have the tables if we want to look at them. But yeah, there are increases there. I think they're significant at like 10% if you are interested in that. The other effects are stronger. We don't see a statistically significant change in the plea rate, just to make sure I've covered all the outcomes. That does not seem to be sensitive to the workload increments. And then we looked at a lot of different dimensions of heterogeneity. We have them in the paper, which will be updated soon on SSRN. And essentially, we're not finding I think there's like a couple of spurious, like little correlations between the workload and some of these characteristics, but there's no consistent pattern going on here with differential workload effects for case outcomes. And so the next slide, I'll get into the time use information. So maybe I should pause again, Andy, if that sounds good. I saw maybe there were some questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. We did have a couple of one from a couple from Bob actually. He's interested, and I'm sure there would be two in a more in uh, in an intuitive understanding of the standard deviation, you explain that it's sort of a big chunk, and I get that.
Yep.
My appreciation is that if you, it's a little bit like starting the attorney at sort of the median level of caseload, and if you bump them up a standard deviation, they'd be something like about the 85th percentile or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think like normal distribution wise, that's a good way to think about it. The actual number that it translates into is 25 additional cases over the window of time. So it's not like it's like on average, we would have 25 more cases. So not necessarily every day, but that's the number of the additional standard deviation.
Right, that an addition of 25 to the average daily count of
Caseload.
co-occurring cases. Right.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's like an attorney who was carrying 50 going up to 75 or something like that.
Exactly. And it's again on average. They might not have it every single day of that, the case whose outcome we're looking at, but it would be, yeah, on average, that's how many more they would have.
Yeah, Bob followed up with a question over what window, and as I appreciate what you've said, it's a daily average, and it's also a daily average for the days in the first 3 to 6 months of the case. Is that
That's
right?
right. Yeah. So I put that in a footnote, but essentially for the low level felonies, we looked at a lot of different windows and we were looking at for like what is the active period of the case? Because again, if we went for the entire length of some of these cases, it would essentially be averaged over a window in which maybe not a lot of activity is going on. So we were really trying to zero in on like the active window. So in the main analysis, and again, like we've tried a lot of different ones of these windows. In the main analysis, it's 3 months for a low level felony and 6 months for a more severe felony. That's the window over which we are averaging. So it's 25 over a 3 month period or 25 additional cases over a 6 month period, depending on the type of case.
Awesome. Thank you. Hopefully that clarifies some of what you're interested in, Bob. Oh, there are a couple of others though that I should just touch on. You do have this note here about less precise increased probability estimates around conviction differences, and I think Bob is quite curious about what it is that you found there.
Sure, we can go to the button. I'm always excited to go to the button. So convicted is in the first, so it's about a 2% change, but it's significant at 10%, which is why there's only 1 star there. So these coefficient estimates are for one additional case. And so this percent change row that I have here is that calculation for the additional standard deviation, again, to kind of make this a more meaningful statement for like a reasonable amount of variation in a caseload, because like the one case increment over these bigger windows may not make a difference. But so these are the exact estimates. Again, I put everything into percentage change terms. So it's 2%, but if it's significant at 10%, I think we have a weaker case for saying that there's no way that our quote null hypothesis of there's no difference based on workload or there's no relationship. We can't say it as confidently as we can for something that is significant at 5%, which is usually kind of our like scientific threshold for feeling really confident. So I think we say in the paper that this is like more suggestive evidence. It's less precisely estimated. And it may be that it might be like a power issue, like we have, depending on whether there's a pooled sample or it's coming just from Kentucky, like we have a good amount of cases. But it may be that we just can't estimate this effect as precisely because of the sample.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So definitely impacts on things like incarceration, maybe not on conviction specifically.
Yeah.
And then Keenan Gleason asked the question, is the prison sentence estimate conditional on conviction? I think I'm not sure how exactly you're estimating it.
Yeah, so the prison sentence, so the incarceration days, like those two are conditional on conviction, yes. And these are also only in Kentucky, just in case anybody had concerns about that. Here, we're removing the zeros, so this is not including folks who have 0 days, if that makes sense. So it's not like we wanted it to be a clean estimate of like if you are incarcerated, what is the effect on the length of incarceration and not include people who do not get incarcerated at all. So yeah, just to kind of like clarify some of the details of those measures.
So given that there's also an effect on incarceration, the length of incarceration is a double benefit for those people in a
Yeah,
sense. Well, if
exactly.
you
So we
go with
see
characterize.
something on both margins, essentially. It's like both whether you're incarcerated at all and then also how long you're incarcerated. And I would say this is like the most, I guess, headline effect that we're finding here that I think mirrors what Aviv Caspi had found in his paper pretty closely.
Awesome. And Bob followed up to clarify, and I think he's exactly right. He's saying if the caseload goes up one standard deviation, the increase in conviction is by 2.439%. Is that correct?
Yes,
It's an increase
this
in
is the percent. I
conviction.
couldn't fit it all in the table, but this is like percent change from the mean when there's an increase of one standard deviation. So that additional 25 cases.
So there is an increase in conviction, but with the caveat that we're not sure
But
if
with
this
the
is statistically
caveat that
significant.
this is less precise, and that could be either
Yeah.
due to our sample or it could be due to, we're picking up something that is just a very weak relationship.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your patience, Amy. I appreciate everybody's questions in the chat, though.
Yeah, these are great
That
questions.
was that was
I'm always
great.
happy to show the table. I don't always get a chance to, so it's always
I
fun.
love the buttons. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
The buttons are great. Let's see if this, okay, this one works. We're good. Um,
Nothing further at this time.
okay, all right. Let's pop over to the time use results. And so here, maybe we can go straight to, well, let me narrate through and then we can decide if we want to look at all those tables too. We definitely have time, so we can do it all. So here, the bigger findings are that they're reducing their overall time spent on the case by about 18%, again, with that additional standard deviation of caseload. So going from like an average busy day to a pretty busy day. This is equal to a reduction of 1 hour from an already very low mean. This is again within the anonymous state. I should have put that back in the, I just want to make sure we're not conflating across different. So this is in the anonymous state. They're reducing their case time for that average case by about 1 hour, and this is off of an already very low mean of 5 hours for the case. So these are again, low level and higher severity felony cases. So these are not misdemeanors. And so my understanding, both from the workload studies that Rand has done, as well as many of our colleagues across other research groups, is that this is already like way lower than what would be recommended for time spent on a felony case of any, especially a severe felony case. And so yeah, so I think we found for policy purposes, this is very troubling for the effect of additional workload, even if, we're maybe not all of like conviction is not responding super strongly, even just in terms of like best practice purposes relative to these like normative recommendations that come out of a lot of the Delphi studies and other workload studies. This is troubling. The next, like, kind of high level finding was that they record 13% fewer tasks overall when those workloads rise. So they're recording fewer things. And I think that would be okay if maybe there's like minor administrative issues that are like maybe they take, I mean, this is pre-COVID, so they're probably not taking Zoom calls rather than like maybe they don't record travel or something. But what they're not recording from what we estimated for, like, we looked at all the different task outcomes, and the ones where we found where they're really reducing their time spent are client communication, review of discovery, and negotiation. And so I have a different version of these slides where I kind of ground these in the ABA standards of like what attorneys should be doing on a given case. I took those out for time constraint purposes, but I think we know in this audience that these are like very important. I think I have to convince economists that it's like important to communicate with clients, but I don't have to convince everyone here. Yeah, so these are where we see the biggest, the significant and fairly large drops. And then I think the other big, like relevant for policy finding that we have is the fourth bullet here, which is like when we're looking at whether they record that task for a given case, we find that the two types of tasks that are most likely to be not recorded at all are legal research and discovery review. And so when I've talked to public defense offices about these findings, this is exactly like what they're often worried about, and putting management practices like oversight or additional support staff to help with making sure that these happen or these get outsourced to someone who can help, because these are kind of like, I think somebody was framing them to me as like the quiet tasks. Like they're not necessarily like communicating with the client. I think we do not see any relationship between that being skipped altogether, but it's sort of like behind the desk, back of the house type of work that needs to be done for this case's argument to be, a zealous defense that we're hoping for. These are exactly what's not being recorded. And I think for discovery review in particular, the time spent on it when it is recorded is suppressed. So it's again like both does it happen and how long does it happen for are dropping substantially with these workload increases. I have one more slide of findings, which is about the heterogeneity, because we find that for time use, some of these findings are particularly strong for certain types of cases, but I can pause again since this is like a bigger chunk of information, just in case
I
there are
think what I
questions.
like to do, Amy, one of the questions in the chat is about heterogeneity.
Yeah,
So, if you don't mind, I think I'd like to ask you to continue, and then we'll
yeah,
see
let's
what
do it.
people have.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so summarizing, again, I kind of made summary slides. So what we find is a very interesting pattern of I said, what looks to us, or what we've interpreted to the best of our ability is like a triage pattern. And I think this is the biggest difference between this first bullet here is the biggest difference between our paper and the very similar paper by Aviv, which is that we find that the public defenders actually decrease the time spent on more severe cases when their workloads rise. I think he finds the opposite, which is that they compress time on a lot of like the low level cases. Our samples are different, our contexts are different, but it does look like there are like pretty significant drops. And so I've read some literature, I think more in like by sociologists. I think it was a sociologist and a criminologist who had a paper that was talking about like there's just a huge number of ways that public defenders in different jurisdictions can triage cases. And so sometimes it's like, okay, should it be, the cases where that extra, I guess the economist like perfect model would be like, where are the cases that need that extra bit of effort the most? Like, and so there's been some sociological literature, like I was saying, where it's like maybe we choose the cases where somebody is facing, it seems in our context that they're choosing the cases where someone is facing a relatively lower level felony, which we unfortunately can't control for people's criminal history. So we don't have that information of, but this was at least something that we were like, this may be one story that kind of reconciles this pattern is like they're defending people who have a lower number of priors or very few priors, because that is something we've seen in more qualitative literature as like, where do they choose to expend their effort? But it's definitely not, at least in this set. So in Aviv's setting, it looks like they're expending effort on like the clients facing the most severe charges, which I think is another kind of like what do you do with your limited time? What is your, in the economist term, like objective function? That would be like who is facing the most severe consequences. We need to focus on them when we have less capacity. We find essentially the opposite, like that they're not prioritizing those clients. They're prioritizing the clients who are facing relatively less severe charges under these workload constraints. So I think that's it's the kind of thing where I'm like, how does this vary across? Since we have such an interesting patchwork of different indigent defense systems across the country, like do those match the training that people receive, or is this just something that we're seeing based on people's individual choices? And that's not something we've been able to uncover in our given settings, especially since the data is from quite a while ago now. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say about the first finding. The second, we find that it's there's a much stronger correlation between being a less experienced attorney and cutting time on legal research and discovery as workloads rise. What I want to give a caveat here is that we had to estimate this model differently such that we are not saying that this is a causal finding. So it might be like the way that they're assigned to different courtrooms means that they spend less time on legal research and discovery because it's not necessary for those cases. So I put that in the footnote to make that clear. Like, we're not saying that this is like being less experienced means that you cut your time on these cases, but it's an interesting pattern that we were able to uncover because we have that experience information. And then just like what's not written here. So we do not find differences across different types of defendants when workloads rise, which I think is reassuring for equity purposes. And we don't find differences. So we also have the attorney demographics. We don't find differences across different types of attorneys in how basically those are just not significant. There's not significant differences. I think everybody is experiencing or is behaving similarly, at least for the time use, and has similar consequences for the case outcomes. And so I wanted to also tie this finding just briefly as I continue talking. What's interesting here is that we find that they're spending less time on the severe felony cases, but we don't find that those are the cases that are like receive even longer relative sentences as the work. Like, we don't find that what happens in the time use comes out in the case outcomes. Like, we don't see worse case outcomes for severe cases disproportionately, right? Like, that was my previous slide. We don't find consistent patterns by any of these characteristics. There's no statistical significance there, but we do find like this very strong relationship in decreasing time, which is interesting. And it could be that we're just not detecting the right case outcomes. Like, maybe we weren't able to find like, okay, what is like the the sentence that this should get. We're just looking at like incrementally longer sentences. But I think if we maybe had some different outcomes or richer data on plea information, maybe we would be able to see what's happening. Like, if they're decreasing time, why doesn't that mean that everything gets worse for those cases specifically? So I think that's kind of like something we've done our best to reconcile in the paper, but I think is a very interesting like they're insulating those clients even if they're at least by the measures we're able to look at. Um, so the last slide is just conclusion. So I can go through that and then we could go to questions, Andy, if that sounds good.
Yes, perfect.
All right. Brief wrap up. Essentially, what we find is that higher workloads are driving worse case outcomes, particularly incarceration length for these low-income defendants that they're serving. And I guess the broad way I sum this up is that it is inhibiting public defender caseload management from what we've seen in the time use data. If you look in the paper, there's a back of the envelope calculation that looks at basically like, because we're seeing longer incarceration sentences, we can look at, okay, how costly is that to a given for a given defendant, and then like what would be the cost of adding an additional public defender such that we could lower the workload of an average office. You can see those details in the paper, but it's essentially a calculation showing, and it's not even taking into account like all the other costs to a defendant. It's just like the literal cost to the state of incarcerating that defendant longer. So that's, I think, something to look at. And then secondly, I think for the time use analysis, this has interesting implications for, like, I kind of framed it as targeted support. I think it could look more like different types of oversight. There are lots of public defense offices that do this type of time use collection, I think, for the purposes of like ensuring, like managing case management by individual attorneys. I think there's also a strong argument for support staff to help with some of these behind the desks or quiet tasks that I was referring to. So I think those are kind of the two big takeaways. One I wanted to mention is, because I get asked this a lot, I didn't put it in the slide, but what if we just reallocate the cases, right? So we did look, and you can see the details in the paper, at whether there are nonlinear effects, meaning like when we cross a certain threshold of workload, do things suddenly get a lot worse? And again, this could be just the quirks of our sample or our sample size or something, but we do not find significant effects. I think that in Aviv Caspi's paper, he did find some evidence of nonlinear. So there could be a redistribution that might make things better. I think our findings are more like it's a linear effect. It's getting worse with every incremental case. So even if you move the cases around in the current pool of public defenders, we're not going to see better outcomes on average. It's more like if you have support staff or something additional public defenders to lower the caseload. So I just wanted to mention that at the end because I think that's an interesting takeaway.
Thank you, Amy. This was fantastic. There
Yeah,
are
thank
a
you.
whole bunch of questions in the chat,
Cool.
including some that folks just sent to me directly. So if you don't mind, I'll try
Yeah.
and like walk through them. Um, uh, Bob Berkowitz had a couple of substantive questions that we can perhaps return to and just clean up first. Forrest Good and Cynthia Lee both had good ones. I might ask them to actually speak their questions unless they feel they've already been answered. And I also did say that I would reach out to my colleague Malia Brink to get a question from her and would give her sort of the right of first reply. So she was able to send me one.
Awesome.
Um, and so I'll start there. Actually, this is a question that was on my mind as well. I wonder if you were able to do any assessment, and Malia wonders if about the quality and completeness of the timekeeping data, particularly because you're finding in part is that when defenders become more overloaded, there's less evidence that they're doing things, and one thing that we do know from practice anyway is that public defenders don't always do a very good job at timekeeping. And one thing that could happen as people get busier is that they do a less good job of it. Do you have any concerns about the validity, particularly, because of things like this opposite finding that you have to Caspi's about the diminution of time spent on felony cases?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think so our time use data is coming from this anonymous state, and we have 3 years. So we have 2014 through 2016. In 2014, my understanding from conversations with the administration there was that they had substantial monitoring of the time use completion. So we were not able to, like, there is no way within the data set that we have, unfortunately, to validate beyond basically rerunning all of our models on the 2014 data alone, thinking that because of what they have told us about the quality is more likely to be accurate. And we do see like towards 2050, this isn't reflected in the analyses because we basically we create, like, there are more fine-grained individual tasks than the ones that we have in the analysis. We basically grouped them so that it wasn't affected by this change over time. But we see like client communication other, like rather than client communication via email or like something more specific, like they get more general. So we could see a little bit of that the change in quality. So what we do is basically re-estimate all the models related to time use on 2014. But yeah, the results are similar. I think the magnitudes are similar. It's a smaller sample, of course, but I think that's the best we've been able to do with sort of validating it. I think a more robust study would have more of like a qualitative component where we could like get a sense of the fidelity to filling out the time use or like an audit of a small number of samples or something. But it can be really hard to track, especially for these like harder to observe tasks. Like maybe knowing email records is one thing, but knowing like how long you spent on legal research is definitely like a limitation, I think, for this study.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Oops.
Thank you. I mean, and the
Yeah.
zeroing out of certain activities and also the evidence of prioritization of activity types is fascinating. But
Yeah.
um, I read that heterogeneity by case type thing as actually I read it as another instance of triage of prioritizing certain cases rather than certain activities. But I agree. It's it's totally fascinating. Um, I on Bob's question, this is returning back to the question about standard deviation. You clarified it was a 25 case deviation. And Bob actually asks, I was trying to run back to the paper and find the answer to this. What the average, what from what mean actually? Is it usually about 50, upon which 25 is stacked?
Yeah, 50 is the average for
Okay.
the average daily caseload measure. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Bob had one other comment in the chat also, which was that with that conviction rate that we were looking at, with the 2% increase, he thought the conviction rate was already a bad conviction rate, and a slight, as I read your comment, Bob, a slight increase didn't make him feel much better about where the conviction rate ended up, but any improvement would be helpful. Um, that's Bob's comments as I read it. Forrest Good also had a question about specifically the time tracking data. By the way, people should feel free to put their questions in chat or to raise their hands. I'm very happy to call on people to ask their questions. They may have had more, they may be able to offer more context if we do that. But Forrest's question is about how the time tracking data are actually are produced. He asks, is the time tracking exact from a stopwatch or in 1/10 of an hour, like traditional billing?
So it's been a little while since I looked at the raw data. I think it's two decimal places. And so I think that they're putting in increments of an hour, but it's not a stopwatch where we have like a very, very long decimal place. Like I don't like so I used to do like billing in litigation consulting, and it would be like you start the clock and you stop the clock. I don't think that's what they were doing here. I think especially back in 2014. Yeah.
Right. And the same in Kentucky and your anonymous state, I suppose.
And the time use data only comes from the anonymous state.
Right,
So yeah,
right,
in the
right. That's
anonymous state,
important.
this was the practice I understood.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Forrest commented also, so attorneys cut deep work, research, and body cam review when they have more procedural or administrative reactive work that is mandatory to all cases when they have more cases. Hard to find time to do research when all your day is court settings and returning calls. Is that consistent with your sort of interpretation qualitatively of what you see in the activities that they prioritize and don't prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, I was thinking of it as like there were tasks that involved other parties, which would definitely continue to happen, and I think had incrementally less of a decrease in time spent, if I remember my percentage changes correctly. But so like I think that those two, I think deep work is a nice phrase for it. I was calling it quiet work, but yeah, like deep work tasks were taking the biggest hit, both in being removed and deprioritized. And I think it was like these are primarily solo tasks where it would be more difficult to monitor. And so both monitor and to like have the accountability. Like I always make my meetings, but do I do every small research task that I need to do throughout the day? Like maybe not. So I think it to me it seemed like a very intuitive way to compress limited time.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen this referred to as an instance of the principal agent problem before, actually. This is like things that are poorly overseen are no longer done.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I want to, there are a couple of questions here by Cynthia Lee, um, Cynthia, if you, I'll read out what you wrote, and then if you want to add to it, you should certainly feel free to unmute because I'm sure there's a lot of thinking behind this. The first question that she asked was, did the reduction in time or type of tasks vary by case severity? And in fact, you did address that in your heterogeneity analysis. And she also asks, could the reverse triage effect result from the, I assume this is a diminution of time on the most serious cases, from the fact that attorneys are already spending so little time on low-level felonies that there simply isn't any discovery review, etc., that can be cut?
Yeah, I think that could. So I don't think that we found that those effects were more intense for and we measured high level, it was both like the measurement for high level felony as well as like whether it was a violent crime and whether it had a relatively higher number of charges. So we kind of measured that like this this relatively severe, like it showed up across different metrics, essentially. Um, we could look at the averages to see, yeah, like are those things not happening? But I think my my concern again from kind of like the ABA standards perspective, I guess, was that from my understanding, like some amount of these tasks should occur
Hmm.
regardless of even for like we don't have like really low level misdemeanors in the sample at all, or like something where like a traffic infraction or something. Like these are all, everyone is facing some amount of prison time. So I think then the concern is like these cuts matter at any level. But I think that could be an interesting thing to look into.
The reason
Thank you.
that
Did
I
you
asked
follow
this,
up, Cynthia?
yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
reason that I asked this is that when I've done workload studies with attorneys, where we are taking time use data and then we are doing like a mini Delphi process to ask where do you need to add time into the model. They
yeah,
very often will add the most time into those minor case types because they say, we know that the ABA standards say that we should be doing discovery review. Realistically, right now we are prioritizing the
yeah,
people who have the most sentencing exposure, the most serious cases. We're actually doing some discovery review in those cases, but we're not doing very much in these minor cases. So they will ask to add more time to the minor
mm,
cases to get at the things that they're not currently able to do. So I was wondering if kind of the reverse was happening here, where um, right now they're prioritizing, if they're, under an average workload, they're prioritizing their most serious cases. And when they have to cut something, there's they have to cut from those cases that they already have prioritized because there's just
right,
nothing
right,
left
right,
to
right.
cut on the low end.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like they've cut them down already. Yeah, we'll definitely think about how we could look at that in the data because I think it's a really interesting question that can kind of like reconcile some of it because I don't feel like this was the most intuitive. Like a lot of our findings are pretty intuitive. I think this was less intuitive from me. Yeah.
I was wondering, actually, possibly complementary to that, and also bringing in the fact that you didn't have a nonlinearity finding. So you concluded that there wasn't necessarily a threshold beyond which, when caseloads are alleviated, um,
Yeah, we did not find that.
so I guess services somehow even out. And I have to admit, my intuition is counter to that as well, because there ought to be a point when your caseloads are very, very low when the effect of, say, reducing a case by yet another case isn't actually felt, right? There should be some threshold that you cross when you can finally do all the services that you need to do for a case. And the fact that you didn't find any nonlinearity makes me wonder if what's happening is your caseloads are from jurisdictions that are high caseload jurisdictions. And all of your variation is between very stressed attorneys and moderately stressed attorneys. And you don't
Yeah.
actually have variation covering attorneys who sort of have reasonable caseloads, which would, I don't know if this is right, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
could be that you can't see the nonlinearity for that reason. And it might also be that that's why you see what Cynthia is saying.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting, and it would be really interesting to see, yeah, just like if this type of study could be done in more locations. Because I would say, like, kind of the background story of when I was in grad school, interested in studying workload effects, the places that were interested to potentially share data with me were ones that were struggling, like anecdotally at least, with their workloads. And so I don't think like it's by accident that like I didn't get a random set of data. I think it was from places that had, and I mean, 50 cases on average is a pretty substantial number of cases to have like on a given day of a case, like 50 open cases, I should frame it as. Um, and that was like the average across the sample. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, that yes, interesting.
Like maybe the
I
nonlinearity would show up in a place where, yeah, we're not looking at like such a particular slice of attorneys with particular workloads, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but it feels like at some point people should have enough time. You should at some point see the effects diminish where
Yeah. I think we had kind of taken away that we probably just don't have enough sample to detect these thresholds. Since I do
Mhm.
think that that's a consideration.
Yeah.
And I think in Aviv Caspi's paper, he does find some nonlinearities. So I think that that is a story that holds for this type of question
Yeah,
in
yeah.
general.
I
But yeah.
and the reason that I think we all harp on it is because actually in the field we have caseload limits, right? And so the idea of finding a value below which things get better and above which things are unacceptable is quite important to us. And that's and it's not the case that your findings couldn't be used for that, but anyway, it's interesting to consider. It's also not necessarily the case that there is a threshold, right? But it's interesting to search for one for sure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I actually, regarding again, actually the sort of instruments that we have in the field, instruments by which I mean kind of policy instruments, we do have these caseload studies, and the caseload studies tend to specify thresholds of caseloads by new cases assigned rather than cases, as it were, co-occurring or carrying cases or simultaneously
Mhm.
open cases. It's interesting to me that as I appreciate it, you use uh, the last 2 months of new cases assigned as an instrument for the number of cases that are open at the same time as the incident case. And you do that on the understanding that the new cases assigned in the last 2 months will be as good as random because they
Yep.
come from whatever case, whatever court you're assigned to. And I actually wonder, I think that your empirical strategy is the right one, but given that out there in the world, there are these standards that talk about caseloads and limit them in terms of new assignments, and you already
Mhm.
have random variation in the number of new assignments. Whether there is even a simpler modeling strategy here, which is you actually use those last 2 months as the predictive variable and skip the IV part.
Yeah.
Maybe that's stupid, but I wonder
No, no,
because it
not at
happens
all.
in the real world, if that would be of interest.
Yeah, and I think in the paper we have, they call it like the reduced form. So it would be, yeah, you just directly use the instrument of those, that chunk of newly assigned cases, your like inflows. I think just for like conceptual purposes, we were looking to capture this kind of like stock of cases, but we are definitely like that stock, as I explained in the previous slides, is not like has components that are random in that there's new cases coming in this lumpy pattern, and then there's the cases that are still open, which that may be something that we're concerned about for saying anything causal. So yeah, so I think the results are similar for if we just use that instrument directly. I think that was kind of our justification, but I think it's like a great point to show both, since a lot of those workload standards are thinking specifically about the inflows of cases and not the stock.
Yeah, thanks. Bob, I see has a couple of questions and is waving his hand. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks. This is really interesting, but I never took statistics, so I don't understand a lot of what you and Andy are talking about. But why is 25 cases a standard? I mean, that's 50% increase from what your mean is. It's very hard for me. You know, I'm I'm trying to offer assistance to various offices that are coping with workload. And I'd like to be able to say that there's this study that says increases in caseload reduce the quality of work, which I think you're saying, but a 50% increase in caseload is astonishing. I mean, why is that a standard deviation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think like these results can be like there is an incrementally worse. Like we were using the standard deviation essentially to translate. So I think this is like a one standard deviation is usually recognized as like this is yeah, like there's a relatively high chance of this additional increment of caseload happening during while you're holding that case. But I think like as we saw from the like there is a very small from as we saw from this the statistical tables, like this is like a 0.08% increase based on one additional case. So like I think the takeaway of like things are incrementally worse is true regardless of what quantity of caseload you talk about. Like this is a statistically significant relationship, even with just one additional case. I think we were trying to translate that into like a more helpful, in terms of like a reasonable amount of variation in caseload. So that was the decision around standard deviation.
From my perspective, talking about one case more has a significant effect. 10 cases more has a really, that is huge. And I guess
Yeah.
what were the assignment numbers for the 2 months? I mean, that to me, that's really important.
Yeah, like what is the variation in the instrument, like in the quantity of cases assigned?
Yeah.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have that in this slide deck, but I'd be happy to chat via email if you want kind of
Yeah,
like more concrete information.
this is really helpful, but I think it would be more helpful to have that information. And,
Yeah,
and I think Andy's absolutely right. These two places had terrible caseloads. And
yeah.
so the minor, relatively minor decrease in outcomes
hmm
is because they were terrible in the first place. They don't file motions, they don't do discovery, they don't investigate, they don't have social workers, and they don't go to trial.
Yeah.
And so, of course, their outcomes are terrible.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more terrible when they have more cases. But it's hard for me, it's really hard for me to grapple with this idea that, okay, if they go from 50 open to 75, then it's bad. Well,
Right.
they probably, I mean, I'm surprised they only had 50 open. And if they did only have 50 open, it's because they were pleading everybody within a month of getting the case.
Yeah.
And so it's really helpful to have this work, but more data of how many cases they were assigned would be really helpful because
Yeah.
if they were getting, I'm guessing they were getting at least 50 cases a month. And if they were getting 50 cases a month, then they were pleading everybody within a month. And
Yeah.
and they're way over any kind of standard. So it'd be really helpful to know that. And
Yeah. No, I think having those numbers like readily accessible with the results to help interpret them would be really useful. That's a great suggestion.
thank
I
you.
think that's probably right. Yeah, I think that, when we go into measuring caseloads, there are these sort of almost different ways to characterize it, right? You've got the inflow, and then you've got the backlog that inflow is adding to, and then you've got the number that you're carrying day to day, and then of course you've got the number that you're pushing out the door. And it is true that depending on whether you measure cases using, if you use only one of those metrics, then you won't capture the other thing, right? I mean, an attorney can take on, let's say for a moment that an attorney could take on 50 new cases a month. It's very different if that attorney is already sitting on a backlog of 1,000 cases to take on those new 50 or something like that. So yeah, this sort of context of the case flow, I think, might just help people in the field to sort of interpret and situate
Yeah.
these numbers with relation to whatever they see in their jurisdiction.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion.
Well, this has been super valuable, folks. I want to ask Divya, I'm pretty sure we were scheduled to go for 75 minutes. Yes, we're just coming to the end. So I want to thank very much Dr. Mahler and Xian for sharing their work. I hope you found it constructive, Amy. This was
This is
enormously
like the
vigorous.
best audience for this presentation. So thank you so much
Yeah,
everyone for your
yeah.
questions. I put my email in the slides. If you're interested in chatting more about the study, I also wanted to put a quick plug. RAND does lots of partnerships with public defense and advocacy organizations to do studies, either like evaluations of reforms or workload studies. So I think like if there's interest there, my email is also available. And yeah, just thank you so much.
Yes, they are worth it and they are very energetic. So we certainly appreciate it. You're a great community members, and thank you again for sharing, both of you. This is tremendously important work, and we love to dig into it, and we love to see these new discoveries that are in some ways validating of everything that we thought we knew about public defense, and also in some ways challenging. And also, perhaps more importantly, in some ways, just revealing. We always learn something new. So thank you to both of you. And thank you so much to our audience for some great questions and participation. You made this easy for me, all of you. So thank you for that too. We'll see you again next time.
Sounds great. Thank you.